It's Coach John Ferry here from Team Wilpers. Excited as always to welcome you to our athlete briefing here for week 5 of the Half Marathon Challenge. I hope everyone is having an amazing week 4. I'm going to adjust here in our new format. I don't get to see what it looks like ahead of time, so I'll get rid of a little of that clutter. So let's talk about week 4. So we were all easy runs here this week. So let's talk about our goals. Goals were just to rest, allow our bodies to recover from the previous 3 weeks of tough training. We not only had elevated training stress week by week by week, we had either a distance test in there or progression. So it was a big 3 weeks to kickstart. This is a little bit of an opportunity to rest, recharge, and hopefully get retooled for what will now be another big 3-week block here. I'm going to remind you, of course, to keep going in, checking those boxes, chasing that 100% completion percentage. It is now, as has always been, the best way to put yourself in a position to be successful here in this challenge. Now to our week 5 workout. So we're starting the week with another endurance run plus strides for most, or another VO2 max run. So certainly you might ask at this point of the challenge, why on earth are we doing another endurance run plus strides? We've done that, and it's not because I can't think of any other workouts, I promise you. We keep returning to these endurance runs plus strides because the endurance energy zone is the #1 contributor to our half marathon. So this is the bread and butter, if you will, of our half marathon challenge. So it's not that we can't repeat it too much. It's one of the better workouts we can get in here. However, if you feel like challenging yourself a little bit more, if everything's going incredibly well for you, that's wonderful. We have that VO2 max workout. We're expanding a little bit over the last time. Just going to work on those above threshold paces. There's some power and economy that comes with the kind of VO2 max work as part of an endurance cycle. Key run number 2 is our half marathon pace intervals. So we certainly have been doing some of these. We're progressing it again, obviously. So what we're doing here is spending a big chunk of time working on that sub-threshold training pace, starting to get familiar and maybe even comfortable, hopefully, with kind of what that half marathon pace feels like. And finally, maybe even starting to get a sense of what that pace might look like on race day come here middle of March. So I think this is an important time in the challenge to talk about kind of what that half marathon pace is, right? Because you did the 20-minute distance test. That half marathon pace appeared in your training block. So plenty of conversation, plenty of questions over the course of time of, is this my target race pace? Is this a training pace? Is it something else altogether? Where did it come from? And in essence, what it is a training pace. It is based on a percentage of threshold, that threshold being determined based upon the 20-minute test. So we're using that kind of percentage as threshold to set a good training pace. But for a lot of runners, that's not going to be race pace per se. For some it will, but for many it will not. And what I would kind of urge you to do as these intervals start to get longer is to continue using that pace to really start thinking if this is a pace that's actually going to be sustainable for 13.1 miles. And if not, it's fine to keep using it as a training pace, but at a certain point, you're going to want to kind of pivot those workouts to something that you think you might go out and use as your race day pace. Because you're going to want to get familiar with that. You're going to want to have it kind of incorporated on the road so that when you kickstart that race in the middle of March, that's a pace that you're feeling comfortable with and you're looking to find. For most people, that half marathon pace is going to be a bit of a wide range. It's going to fall anywhere from what that listed half marathon pace is, all the way down to easy pace. And there's no right, wrong, or indifferent in there. You have to obviously find the pace that you feel comfortable sustaining over the course of that time. But if this is your first half marathon, if the distance itself seems incredibly challenging to you, that's okay. We've all been there as well. But you might be much closer to easy pace than actually half marathon pace. I'll talk a lot about different race distances. You always have to train for distance and then you train for time over distance. So if the distance itself is incredibly intimidating, there's not a thing in the world wrong with taking it easy, hopefully you're running across that finish line with arms held high, save the time goals for a different race. So something to keep in mind here. Finishing the week, of course, with our long run. So nice, easy miles. We're kicking it back up here in week 5, returning to that week 3 long run distance range before we continue to proceed over the next couple weeks. So we're all jumping back in here together. We're gonna go into some questions that came up from the group this week. So question number 1. So I'm running the New York City half at the end of the challenge and running a 10K this weekend. Should I try to run it at half marathon pace or 10K pace? And it's a great question, and honestly, there is no right answer here. So what I would say is this, is if training has been going incredibly well, you feel very comfortable with the 10K distance, with the kind of general threshold pace you've been working at, and you're excited about your half marathon training, it might absolutely be worth giving it a go at 10K pace and racing this and using it as a fitness touch point, a speed check-in, and getting a good sense here. Still about 5 weeks out from New York City half, there'll still be also plenty of time to recover and train on the backside of this. So it shouldn't need a huge recovery from a 10K, even if you push it pretty hard. So I would say a 10K effort is a really great way to go there. On the flip side, if you have questions, if maybe you haven't been 100% consistent on training, if you're feeling a little bit disassociated from your pacing and don't really know exactly where that is, there's also nothing at all wrong with, let's say, running at half marathon pace and kind of reducing the pace zone a little bit, kind of running as a tempo, trying to, as we were talking about just a moment ago, find that pace that you might actually start your half marathon at and see how it feels to run for 6.25 miles right there. So it's a great way to look at it, is basically use it as a workout. And then finally, sometimes in those scenarios, you kind of hit the hybrid of that, where if I want an athlete to maybe, have some 10K focus, have some half marathon focus, is the race itself becomes, as I mentioned, a workout. So it might start someone and say, like, I'd really love to start you at half marathon pace for 3 miles. The goal is going to be really in control, to be, to find your pace, to settle in. And in that back half of the race, I want you to pick it up 10 seconds a mile or 15 seconds a mile. We're going to really push on the back half so you can practice that 10K effort, that kind of, potentially above threshold effort, finishing really strong. It's another really good way to go about it. So ultimately you have to kind of look at and think about where your training is, how it's been, where you are in your process, and what you're looking to achieve from the race. And if you're looking for a really good fitness check and you're looking for a touch base on kind of how things are going in training, that kind of race at 10K pace is great. And if you're looking to just kind of figure some things out, kind of find where you are kind of positioned in advance of your half, then running it at a different, slightly more relaxed pace, or running it as a workout is a good way to go about it also. So hopefully that helps. Our next question is, I've learned to not be obsessed with my heart rate when running. However, can we discuss heart rate when running in colder temps? I'm running at the low end of easy pace and even slower than some days, and my heart rate is just through the roof on easy and long runs. Last weekend, I basically ran 8 miles at threshold according to heart rate. My body felt okay during the run, but I did feel quite depleted afterwards. I'm unsure how to keep my RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, comfortable and still be running the appropriate paces. Basically have to walk to stay in zone 2 or zone 3. So happens all the time, and especially in winter, very, very common issue here. And it's gone as far as I actually had an athlete in the past schedule an EKG because they thought they were going to have a heart attack. And ultimately, what is most likely the solution here, I'm going to give it a 99 out of 100 scenario, is that there's really nothing at all wrong with your heart rate. There's kind of 2 issues. One is the air. The air is cold and is dry right now. So most likely not a problem with your heart, most likely a problem with the air here. And the second thing is the heart rate sensor. So the heart rate sensors require moisture to get the best accurate reading. So in this cold, dry environments, when you're that kind of sensor is sitting against dry skin, it's not reading correctly. And it's very, very common to get these elevated heart rate readings at this time of year. So there are things you can do. Certainly I've shared in the past that I have very little faith in wrist-based heart rate in general. It's okay. It does nice enough in the moment, but I would never plan training or racing off of it. So you can certainly wear arm straps or wrist straps that go under your clothing. So you're gonna obviously get a little bit sweatier, a little bit hotter. You're gonna have more moisture. It's gonna read better. It's also gonna read more consistently when going from spring, summer, winter, fall, etc. In addition to that, you can purchase, they actually have an electrode gel. I don't think it's very, very expensive. And you can basically kind of prime these HR sensors in advance. Once again, it's going to be a little bit more difficult with a wrist-based than it's going to be on an arm strap or a chest strap. And the final thing, and maybe what I would suggest first and foremost, is that to not really worry so much about your heart rate during the runs. I always refer to it as kind of a secondary metric. I take a look at it to make sure everything else is lining up. So the things that are more important to me, both as an athlete and as a coach, so I want to know, what the effort felt like for that day. I want to double check it in terms of what the pacing feels like for that day. And if you say you felt great and the pace was good and the heart rate is off, then I'm not too worried about that. It's more often a sensor issue than a heart rate issue. On the flip side, I've certainly, and it happens to all of us, if you feel terrible, the pace is suffering, and then you look at the heart rate and that's off too, it can tell you certainly that there's a problem. But as I mentioned, I call it a kind of a comparable metric to bring heart rate in most instances, and I never will bring it in for the most part if it's not being pulled from a really accurate heart rate sensor. So I've got focus on easy running, nice easy breath, being conversational, focus on your effort, keeping it nice and cool here, and everything else should take care of itself. Let's jump into our next question here, which is, can you talk about how many races you should do over the course of 6 months and what you should be doing in between those races? So it's an interesting question. It's going to be another one for better or worse, that there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. It just kind of depends here. So what I would say is the main thing to be focused on isn't really how many races, are those races supporting your overall A goal? So I'm going to kind of use an example, and I'll pick on myself, who did it poorly in 2024. So last year I was getting marathon ready. In my mind, that was my most important race of the season. And when building my calendar, I should have been picking races supportive of the marathon. What I ended up picking is I picked a 70.3 triathlon. I picked an ultra marathon out on the West Coast on Mount Hood. And in my mind at that time, I thought these were great endurance events and they were going to ultimately lead towards marathon success in the fall. However, in reality, and what many people from outsiders can look in and what I get to do on a coaching perspective and say that these are not very supportive races for that goal. These races ultimately detracted from the A race goal because there is a taper time for each of these races because the distance is substantial. There was the recovery time trying to bounce back from these long kind of hard efforts. And so each time I was losing 2 weeks here, losing 2 weeks there for taper and recovery, and ultimately it kind of stunted training. So a better way would be to kind of look at your schedule, think about your A race, and then think about the races that are supportive of it. So thinking about the marathon, starting early in season, running 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, things that are supportive of that race goal are a really good idea. And you can do these quite often. And I think worth keeping in mind is that the shorter the race, the more often you're able to run it. So most people, even at the pro level, they're really only peaking for a marathon maybe once a year. There could be an argument that could be done twice, but really once a year is where most people are peaking for the marathon. Half marathon, maybe you get a couple. You might be able to get 3 or 4 at tops during the year. You're really probably going to be peaking for 2 10Ks. At that point, you could really run every few weeks. 5Ks, you run every week if you want. It actually is a great opportunity to run 5Ks once a week. You'll get better and better each time. You kind of learn how to race those races and 5Ks in shorter distances. You get to do them pretty often. So when I start season planning, and I think this is ultimately what it comes down to, I lay out where my A races are across the scope of my calendar. And I say A races, B races, C races, because I use the vernacular all the time. But what I'm talking about, A race is my most important race, the one that I really want to go after. So once I lay out my A races, I know how many weeks I have between now and those races. Then I'll start to go in and I'll do my B races. And my B races are going to be the things that I plan to use to support that A race. So going back to our first question, for someone running the half marathon in the middle of March, this 10K right here is an excellent B race. I mean, it could be an excellent A race too, but an excellent B race because it's going to be a great check-in to get ready, 5-6 weeks out from this this half marathon. So it's supportive of the race training. If all of a sudden we had a 20 miler right here, it would be a little bit different. It's possible that it pulls too much focus away from the A race. The 10K is perfect there. And then there's got to be a time and place for fun, certainly. So, I'll kind of put that C race category. And I've got a lot of C races. C races are ones that I really don't care about at all in terms of the actual structure. I might run them as a workout. I might run them for fun. I might pace a friend, but they're things that I have on my calendar that I'm going to go and do. And usually what I'll do in these scenarios, especially in a half marathon or a marathon build, is that will ultimately be part of a long run day where I warm up for a few miles, I run a few mile race, I run a few more miles at the end, and that is just kind of part of a single experience. So what I do say about racing, and I encourage this all the time, is I like athletes to race, how I'll describe early and often. I think there's a huge skill to racing. It drives me nutty when people have kind of 1 to 2 races on their calendar per year. I know logistically sometimes that's it, but it's so much pressure and it's so difficult to put it all on that one day and to kind of show up expecting to perform at a really high level when you haven't been able to practice going through a race day morning, going through the corral system, figuring out waking up early, figuring out the breakfast and transit, etc. These are things that you don't just like inherently, wake up being good at, but they're things that you train and you really hone your system. So as I mentioned, early and often is how I recommend athletes to kind of race during their calendar if able. So once again, I'm sharing all my own stories today, but I think here in the first 6 months of 2025, I have somewhere in the ballpark of 15 races on the calendar, and adding and adding day by day. And as I mentioned, these are not all A races. They're certainly not even all A and B races. So out of those 15, I've got about 2 or 3 targets that are important to me. I've got quite a few that I plan to use as workouts to get ready for those A races. And then I've got quite a few that I have, as I mentioned, very little interest in performance goals whatsoever, but I have lots of interest in going out, being with friends and having fun as part of that race day. And as I mentioned, I'll usually incorporate them into ultimately a longer run or a long run on my weekends. So no right answer. I certainly like the inclusion of races in a calendar. I think you can make it work with a lot of races. I think you can make it work with a few races, but if we're going to leave with one point here, is you want to make sure that they are supportive of the end goal first and foremost. Well, hopefully that was helpful, not too confusing. But otherwise, that is all here for our briefing this week. Thanks as always for joining me here on Friday evening. Can't wait to see you next week. Have a great one.